Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the video. One of the hot button topics of the current generation of systems, particularly when they were first released, was undoubtedly cloud computing. Much was made, of course, of the Xbox One's cloud computing, which was specifically built on the Azure network backbone, which are essentially just a whole bunch of computers located in various regions of the world which make up Microsoft's cloud. These have been used for multiple different titles, including Titanfall, and are naturally also going to be used in the upcoming Crackdown 3 to offload some of the work from the local system to the cloud. However, Phil Spencer is pointing out that he is happy not just to limit this to Microsoft's own Xbox One, but he's happy for Sony or Nintendo or any other company to utilize this technology. And this includes for their own platform exclusives. So in theory, he is saying that he's more than happy for the next Infamous game to run on their technology if that's what the company wants. Now, I do have a couple of thoughts and opinions on this, but I do want to read out his quote before we proceed any further, so you do get it verbatim. It says, and I quote, "Azure services are available to any game, even other platform exclusives we wouldn't keep someone from using," end quote. Obviously, fairly limited characters available in Twitter. So, just so we're all aware, there is a lot of difference between Gaikai, which is what Sony are using at the moment, for example, for the PlayStation 4, and Azure. I'm going to keep things very simple for this video rather than doing an in-depth breakdown, but essentially you can think of Azure as being able to do remote processing. Effectively, it can do things such as handling physics, to being able to act as a remote server, for example for multiplayer, all the way down to running bots and artificial intelligence. In other words, it can do a hell of a lot of stuff. It's very powerful. I've used it multiple times in various projects, whether it be for personal usage or work. It can do things such as holding data, for example, very similar to Dropbox in principle, all the way to being able to create instances of servers which you can create, utilize, and then close down based upon usage and need. So for the sake of argument, if you need a server because a particular project gets a lot of traffic between the hours of 5 AM and 7 PM, but the rest of the time it's kind of dead, then you can fire up extra servers accordingly. Now, this is rather important from a cost and scalability standpoint. This is very different from Gaikai, which essentially acts more of a streaming service. It's not to say that we know all of the details of Gaikai, but you can almost think of it as like a controllable Netflix in some ways. Now, that's kind of... it works very well for what Sony are trying to do, but it's not really in the same vein of Azure. Azure is a really powerful platform, and it competes with other platforms such as, of course, Amazon Web Services and also Rackspace as well. But before we get more into the technical jargon, let's just say that I'm not really surprised by Phil Spencer's answer. Honestly, a lot of the console wars are actually in the minds not really of the console's developers, and by which I mean Microsoft, Sony and Nintendo, but I more mean in the hearts and minds of the fans of those particular systems. It's honestly a case of, yes, of course, they do have some competition in their brains. They do obviously want to outsell the competitor because that's just the nature of things, because obviously at the end of the day they're trying to push their own brand for their own messages and make profit, but they don't hate one another, they don't despise one another, and for the sake of businesses, you're also not going to essentially stop yourself from making a lot of money, because obviously if Sony were to contract Microsoft to utilize their services for the PlayStation architecture, it's going to be quite a lucrative contract for Microsoft, and we know Microsoft are very much becoming a company that wants to offer software on demand on this on-demand streaming thing. We've known this for some time. However, Sony probably would never do it, and there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that Sony have mentioned they're not particularly into cloud computing. They don't really like it as a as an offload. They don't really like the idea of offloading computation to the cloud. There are a couple of reasons behind this, primarily latency related, and obviously at the end of the day, if you don't have an internet connection, you're pretty boned, which is fine for multiplayer games for the sake of argument, Titanfall. But if you're playing another game, a single-player orientated game, let's once again use Infamous for the sake of argument, and your internet connection goes down, and the game relies on that to run, you're screwed. It physically won't work. There can be some fail-safes. For the sake of argument, you could reduce the amount of physics on screen, or maybe reduce the draw distance for those, but even so it's not perfect, and once again latency can be a problem, and these are specific issues that Sony have mentioned in the past, including of course Mark Cerny, who is the lead architect and the mind, I guess you could say, behind both the PlayStation 4 and the PlayStation Vita. The second reason is I have a feeling Sony would never do it because it just isn't particularly good from a PR perspective. Essentially, it would be almost giving Microsoft a feather in the cap. And I think to many people who are knowledgeable in IT, they probably wouldn't care, and they'd say, hey, great, go for it. It makes sense. You've got the infrastructure. You know, it saves Sony building a whole network of servers of their own to do specific things. And, you know, Azure is pretty safe and secure. It's not foolproof by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a pretty good infrastructure overall. It's very scalable. But once again, I just don't think Sony would want to give Microsoft the feather in the cap, because some people are obviously going to be rather critical of it, and it could once again go into the whole fanboy war issue, which is something that I think both companies have been rather good about avoiding. Now, my final thoughts on this one, I think it's kind of cool in theory. My opinions on cloud compute haven't really changed over the past year or two. I think that it's an interesting theory, and certainly if you're dealing with a console which essentially has a finite amount of performance that it can offer. After all, you can't once again put in a faster GPU, you can't put in additional memory, and you can't overclock the CPU. What you can do, of course, is more efficiently utilize the resources which are locally available to you. So in the sake of argument, you can free up CPU cores, which of course Microsoft and Sony have done. They've freed up some of the 7th CPU core, which we've covered rather in depth previously, or you can free up GPU reserves or memory reserves, or you can release drive updates and other SDK improvements to basically wrangle more performance out of the hardware that you've got. But you can't once again put in an add-on card, which is something that was really popular back in, let's say, the days of the Sega Saturn, where you could put in the 4MB card, or even the N64 featured a very similar piece of technology. And other consoles, even the SNES, of course, had the Super FX chip, which was an additional processor which was located within the card itself and helped offload work from the SNES's CPU. But that's not really an option for the PlayStation 4 or the Xbox One, which is kind of a shame in some ways. I think it could have potentially worked, but that's a topic for a different video and a different discussion. So I guess in those scenarios, cloud makes some sense. Once again, for multiplayer side of things, I think cloud is absolutely excellent. I don't really believe that I think it's the best way of doing dedicated servers, rather than having them locally run, to actually have them run on a cloud-based distribution, which can basically fire up a server based upon the number of players. So let's say when it gets really busy, additional servers are created, and then once those servers start to go down, obviously, then they can start reducing the instances. The problem with that, of course, is then it still requires money for the company. It's not like those cloud servers are free because they're in the cloud. They're still using tangible performance and hardware. Just to give you an indication of how this works, although there is some scalability, of course, in terms of the pricing, if you're using a lot of servers, you would contact Microsoft or Rackspace or whichever company that you're relying on for your hosting, but it's still costing money for that, and you can start, once again, go to their price instruction, you can get an idea of how much, in terms of bandwidth on compute instances, something would run you. And essentially, most of these servers, all they're doing is using a server or a compute instance and then running a piece of software locally. And then that, of course, that information is then distributed over the internet based upon the game which is running. And I think it's a kind of a cool technology, just to clarify, but I think its uses are kind of limited. But for the games it does work on, it works rather well, and I think for games like Titanfall it was absolutely perfect, because once again it's a multiplayer focused title. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon, take care, bye for now.